Good evening and welcome. It is time to begin. We are in our 13th time period in the return from captivity. And so we've been plugging right along at it. We will have our singing this coming Wednesday, so that will push us off for a week until we get to the years of silence. And we'll be talking about that next Sunday. That is a time period that a little bit daunting to approach as far as how to teach, because we don't have the best text in how to teach that. But there's a lot of things to cover in that will be helpful for us setting the stage for the New Testament and getting a cultural understanding, a historical understanding that hopefully will allow us to see things in the appropriate context. Several people missing today and traveling and sick, and so let's be mindful of them. But it's good to have everybody here. It's good to be able to sit down and study the Bible together and hopefully glean some good from it. Brother Danny, do you mind leading us in an opening prayer?
Father, we thank you for the opportunity, freedom, and ability to be able to be here tonight, to have study of your word, and hopefully learn and be able to understand it better for our teachers, and pray to give them a ready remembrance of what they mean to present, and we'll all start clear our minds, all the things going on in our lives, and try to concentrate on the lesson. We thank you for our group here, Lord. We just know that we're truly blessed where we live, and the time we live in, the freedoms that we have. We pray we'll never take that for granted. We just pray, Lord, that you will continue to help us understand your word and learn from it and apply it to our lives.
Amen. All right, so we're talking about the return from captivity. We are going to do a brief review, but as you can see from the illustration on here, that's from the Bible Project. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. A lot of our time tonight will be spent in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah with an insertion of the book of Esther. Originally, that was written as one work, and it's not until many, many years later that it was divided into the two. And so we'll be talking through that, and that's really our text for tonight, is Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, not necessarily in that order. But just as a reminder, going through the time period, let's say them very quickly. Before the flood, scattering of the people, the patriarchs, the Exodus, wandering in the wilderness, invasion and conquest, Judges, United Kingdom, divided kingdom, Judah alone, Judah in captivity, return from captivity, years of silence, life of Christ, early church, and letters to the Christians. And so we can see we're getting quicker at that, a little bit better at that. On this slide, I actually put several of them, the years, the time span that each period took. And it helps us, I think, understanding context and some of those details. Some of them we don't know specifically or exactly, so these are estimates. Let me just put it that way, best estimates. Tonight we're going to be talking about the return, and so I've got it listed between 105 and 110 years. Letters to the Christians I put as 30 to 60 years. It's according where you take the dating of the book of Revelation. And so it does make a difference in that as far as those time periods. But that's kind of just the gist of that. All right, bear with me just a moment to click through. So let's do it this way. Click through a bunch of slides. Let's go. All right. Starting there at Judah alone. So we're familiar, hopefully pretty well, through the United Kingdom, divided kingdom. In Judah alone, we focused on those three major kings. There were really 9 that we talked about, but for memorization purposes, it was Hezekiah, good king, Manasseh, bad king, but repented later, and then Josiah, he and Hezekiah are about as good as they ever had. And so we talked about those 3 there in Judah alone. And then we got into the captivity, and that's where we talked about last class period. And for memory work, you only have Daniel and Ezekiel. Those are the 2 things that are listed there. Daniel is pretty straightforward as far as the first 6 chapters or so are narrative, and then the last 7 through 12 are not as straightforward. It's more prophetic in nature. And so we did talk about the first section of Daniel and then the insertion of Ezekiel. That's where, and Zach talked us through there. But there at the end of the book of Daniel, the most famous story from that ending text is that of Daniel in the lion's den. I think most everybody's familiar with that, and how those situations went down. One thing that I wanted to bring out from the book of Daniel, there in chapter, it matters more to some of the study we're getting into both tonight and moving forward. There in Daniel chapter 5, starting in verse 30 and 31, says, "That same night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. And so we have a changing of the kingdoms. And that's really all it gets. It happens so quickly and so smoothly. What 2 kingdoms just almost, one faded immediately and one popped in? Babylonian fell just that quickly overnight. They were being weakened. There's a lot of different reasons for that, economic reasons and political reasons, but they fell, and then immediately the Medo-Persian came in. The Medes and the Persians were actually a co-reign together, and then the Persians ultimately absorbed them, but they were a coupling that was kind of interesting, that they didn't really ever war with one another. They kind of worked together and collaborated, and ultimately the Persians kind of just absorbed the Medes in that. But here we see that Darius the Mede received the kingdom. And so we get the section about Daniel in the lion's den. And so we're no longer under Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. We're now under Darius and the Persians. And so why is that important to moving forward down the road? Crawford? So we see the progression of Daniel's dream. We had the head of gold, chest of bronze, and so now we're moving on down that road. And so it's the historical prediction. It's coming true. One interesting fact: the Medo-Persians were from around 616 to 550. It's about 65 years where they were together. It became just exclusively the Persian Empire from 550 to about 330. And so that will take us, the Persians will take us all the way through into the years of silence. And so it is the Persians in power with everything that we're talking about, both for tonight and the remainder of the text that we have as we get into the years of silence.
Luke, we may throw in just Jeremiah would belong technically in this group during captivity. We talked about him a little bit as he was warning Jerusalem and the kings of Judah about the impending Babylonian captivity, telling them to, don't make war against Babylon, don't resist. He's actually continues his ministry into the captivity itself. Chapter 29 is a significant one. In fact, one of the most well-known Bible verses that you'll probably see just floating around by people who don't very well understand the context of it. The plans that I have for you to do good and to prosper you. You've probably seen that. That's Jeremiah chapter 29:11. The context of that statement is actually written to the Jews who are in captivity, and as they are facing what seems to them to be a hopeless situation, removed from the promised land, the temple destroyed, he's reminding them, giving them hope. I haven't forgotten you. And that's when he gets into the 70-year prophecy as well, saying 70 years is the time that you're going to be in captivity, then you're going to return home. So Jeremiah does kind of fit here in this both before and after the captivity as well, even though he's not up there.
We've got several of these prophets that are so, it's hard to go.
Their ministry stretches over multiple time periods.
That's exactly right. It's hard to leave them out, but when we're having to go as quickly as we are, we will include them when we get to the third cycle here, just starting in a few weeks. But it's hard to even pull them all in and give them the credit they're due. As we move to the return, that's where we are tonight. The 4 major names that I want us to remember for memorization purposes are Zerubbabel, who led the first return, and then Esther, who falls in that next chronological section, and then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. And so those are our 4 major figures of this time period. Now there are others, as you can see at the top. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are all here, but they are not as central to what's going on.
Focusing largely on the story, and they've got more of a background role.
That's right.
Not insignificant by any means, but just they're not so much involved in the narrative.
Right. Well, for instance, Haggai and Zechariah, I'll mention them briefly when we get to them, but they simply happen there in Ezra chapter 4 when there was the lull in rebuilding the temple, and they were there to prophesy and be a reminder to spur on the people to get back busy building the temple. And so they had a specific role to play and did specific prophecies, but they, in the narrative, just had a very small role in the narrative itself. So, and then Malachi is that last one who ends this return section, as we call it, and brings us to the years of silence. So that will be our last figure there. So let's start talking through the book of Ezra. If you're there, just working through that book very briefly. The first major section there in the book of Ezra is the first return. And what was the first name I just referenced that we need to remember? Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the first leader to bring the Jews back. And so that's what we have here in Ezra chapter 1 and 2. It's really important that we read just the first couple verses there of the book of Ezra, because it gives us a lot of context. It ties in a lot of specifics there. So it says, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to complete the word of Yahweh from the mouth of Jeremiah, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he had a proclamation passed throughout all this kingdom and put it into writing, saying, thus says King Cyrus, Yahweh the God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. I think it was in the questions. I know when Emily and some of the kids were working through the questions, it talked about that prophecy. Did y'all get where that prophecy happened there in Jeremiah? 25, 11, and 12. You can see it's actually, I think the book gives a whole range from 24 towards the end of the chapter to verse 11 and 12 of chapter 25. And so this is a name that we've heard of before. Matter of fact, we heard it about 150 years before. And so this is a specific prophecy that is being fulfilled, and this text here in Ezra chapter 1 is tying that together. Just another example of God keeping his word. Where before Cyrus was ever born, he was mentioned, and before the Persians were even a thing, God being faithful. And so we see that getting set up there. Also there in chapter 1, it talks about, also King Cyrus brought out the articles of the house of Yahweh, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought out of Jerusalem and put in the house of his gods. That's a reference back to 2 Kings 24, 2 Chronicles 36, and Daniel chapter 1, when Nebuchadnezzar took those things. And so we see that being fulfilled. We see Cyrus and that God stirred him to do those things. I really like that phrase. Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia. And so we see him fulfilling what God had commanded or what God had for him. And so we get a lot of that set up there in chapter 1. It's a relatively short chapter, just 11 verses. Chapter 2, it reads like Genesis 5, Genesis 10, back half of Genesis 11. It's a list of names, or the listing of the tribes, you might say there at the numbering, at the census. Because these are the ones that went back with them from captivity. And this is where things can be confusing for us, in that there are some who stay in captivity. And we'll see that with Esther and Mordecai and that story when we get there in just a moment. But this 49,897 people, as they're listed here, are the ones that returned back to Israel, back to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel. And this is that first wave. Now, it's important to note that this return, this type of return, does not happen every time. We have both Ezra and Nehemiah returning, but did they lead the same quantity of people? Not near. They may have had a small following go with them, but not to the point of nearly 50,000 people. And so we see a major return happening here. And so this is a very definitive line in history for them with what's going on here.
And I think there's a point to be made about the faith of these individuals that are willing to go back, because I think they're going to encounter that sometime along the way. There's going to be a shortage of priests and Levites. You see, in Babylon, they'd been there for 70 years. I mean, they'd built homes, their families were there, they were comfortable and profitable there. And so to go back to Jerusalem, which was destroyed, which had no walls, which had no temple, I mean, what's in Jerusalem that I should go back there? And so these individuals, I mean, they're to be praised for their faith and their willingness to go back, trusting in the promise of God that He's going to restore the city to greatness again. And, I mean, you just have to appreciate that, because so many of them didn't. This is a minority of the Jewish people, I think.
I think you're right. They were even instructed to make their homes there in Babylon and to make themselves comfortable, because they would be there so long. But because of that, now we see this return. And that's why we talk about our remnant shall return. We know what a remnant is. It's that small part of the whole. And so this remnant is returning. And so very important there. Once they get there, that next section there in chapter 3 tells us some of the things that they did. The altar is built, sacrifices begin, and a feast is observed. Not just any feast. There in chapter 3, verse 1, it's the Feast of Booths. It goes by several different names. But it's interesting that they return, and we see in the 7th month, there, chapter 3, verse 1, they came, and the Feast of Booths is observed on the 15th day of the month. So if that's when they got there, they got busy pretty quickly and got things going, and were doing what they were instructed to do. If moving 50,000 people is not a small feat. And so we see them getting back and getting the altar built, sacrifices beginning, and observing the feast. Would that have been something they were able to do in Babylon?
Jerusalem was where God's name was placed.
So very likely that this had not been done in their lifetime. And so it would have been at least not to this degree. Yes, sir. Usually wasn't that 14 days later that they were to still go? Am I thinking of something else?
I was thinking they were still supposed to be at Jerusalem if they were going to do that. It gave a different, I think, date for them to do it, but I don't think that it was compromised where they could do it anywhere, wherever they were at. I may be wrong on that, but I'm thinking it was in Jerusalem they had to do it. So.
Well, this is definitely significant, because they were able to build an altar and be there and not be amongst all of the pagans that they were. So we see that happening there in chapter 3. And we see the work of the temple beginning there in chapter 3 and verse 7. Crawford?
Would the Nehemiah and Mordecai be different than those?
I would think so, just because when we find Mordecai, he is in Persia. He was in Susa specifically, that's right. And so, which is the city of the citadel. So I would think that that's probably a common name, but I can't say with
I can tell you that the name I mentioned there is different. I mean, I think, what is it? You probably got the stat later. It's like 50, 60 years, maybe even 80, between the return of the first remnant and then the second that Ezra's going to bring in. So I think it's just beyond the lifetime of when Nehemiah would have lived, and he's going to actually usher in lead the third return.
Yeah, I believe it's 536 is the first return, and was it 458 the second return? Okay. I'd have to check for sure, but
I don't believe these are the same two. To answer your question.
I don't think so either. The other one, or somebody else. There's another mentioning of who was it? Emily and I talked about it. Not Malachi. Anyway, there was another name that was doubled, and it was mentioned here in the early part of Ezra, and the one that we're familiar with, maybe in Zechariah. But anyway, it was mentioned again. There's the prophet there later, and when you do the math, it's 60 to 100 years of the two. And so some of these names do repeat. And we know names can be confusing. I mean, we just got finished with the kings. So I think we recognize, but in this story, it's just an honorable mention. But in the book of Nehemiah, if it's the same person or not, a great character of significance there.
I think Zerubbabel's important to notice about him. If remember, through the prophecies, it was foretold that Jehoiachin would not have a son sit on the throne. And so he, Zedekiah which was not his son, which was his brother or uncle or something.
Uncle.
It was the last king to sit on the throne in Judah. And so Zerubbabel, if there were going to be a king of Judah, it would have been him. He fell into the Davidic lineage. So you find him in Matthew chapter 1 in Jesus' lineage. So he's called governor here. And this goes back to what God foretold, that there was not going to be another king to sit on the throne there. But he carries on the Davidic lineage that's going to ultimately bring forth Jesus. So interesting to see that he was the one that kind of led the first return back.
So as we move through this, we're not going to talk about the work on the temple much here. They did get some work done to the point that people started noticing.
I think they laid the foundation.
That's right. They laid the foundation as they were instructed. And it's important to realize, and that's why I wanted to take the moment to read that there in Ezra chapter 1, because Cyrus had a proclamation there in verse 1 that was passed throughout the kingdom. This was well known. And so it was at his instruction. He told them to do this. And so we see the discouragement that goes on. And then when we get over to Ezra 4, we're dealing with King Artaxerxes. And these people that have offered, the adversaries that are discouraging their work, and those that are offering to help and then are saying, no, we don't want your help, because they were pagans. They shouldn't have been helping anyway. And so we see the work on the temple and the discouragement that goes on. And because of that, there's a decree that is made there at the end of chapter 4, around verse 17, where the work is stopped. Because, well, you had a change of kings, you had a lack of authorization, and so we do know that ultimately he goes back and checks the records. Oh, you're right. There was a command that they were supposed to follow and to do this. So go ahead and keep on going. But it did stop for a while. I believe it stopped, from what I understand, for about 16 years. Brother Waldron mentioned it as he compared this to him when he was a kid. That they had a 47 Mercury, that whenever they had a heavy dew, the car wouldn't crank, and so they couldn't go to church. And so he always prayed for rain on Saturday nights. He said he was just looking for an excuse. And he equated that with what was going on here with the work in the temple. That, oh, we can't do it? Okay, we'll just go do what are these other things we wanted to do instead.
Build our houses rather than that Lord's house.
That's exactly
what
right.
Haggai gets on them for.
And so they use this as a easy cop-out, an easy way. They didn't fight against it. Not near like what you see with Nehemiah, where they're working with one hand or having a sword to their belt and still working. That's a lot different stick-to-itiveness than what we see here in the book of Ezra. So we see the work of the temple is stopped, and it's here that we have the work of Haggai and Zechariah. And just very quickly, Haggai, it's a prophetic book to encourage the Jews to rebuild the temple. It emphasized putting God's work first. Through a series of divine messages, Haggai urges the people to overcome apathy and prioritize the restoration of the temple so they might receive God's blessing. Zechariah contains visions that encourage the Jews to continue rebuilding the temple and to remain faithful to God, with emphasis on future restoration and the coming of the Messiah. Zechariah's visions also highlight the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom, the cleansing of sin, and the establishment of a righteous ruler from David's line. And so we have those two books prophesy during this window of time. So here in chapter 4, they're in the midst of that. And so once finally the scroll with Cyrus's decree is found there in chapter 6, the rebuilding begins again, and we see the things going on. And so finally there in chapter 6, halfway through, the temple is finished. And that was what Zerubbabel was supposed to do, get the temple finished. And so that's what we see going on here. I listed these out. These are some of the leaders of the kings during this time. We have Cyrus the Great, Cambyses II, who conquered Egypt during his reign. You have Darius, who we've just talked about, ruled the Persian Empire at its peak, and the second temple was completed during his reign. That's where we are right now. And then Xerxes, who is also Ahasuerus. Where does that name fit in? Esther. He is the king in Esther's day. and then Artaxerxes the first, who commissions Ezra and Nehemiah to return. So we're right now at these last two kings on my list. Not the last kings of the Persians, but of the ones that are significant to us. And so, getting into the book of Esther, just to go through that quickly, because I did not intend for that to take 25 minutes. Hopefully a familiar story to us. If you haven't read it lately, it's a great story. It opens there with the king of Persia's greatness and all the things, the partying that's going on. And yes, this is from the Bible Project. Some of you might recognize these. When you start looking at them closely, there's some good details that will jog your memory on things. And so they can be useful. Not all of them, but some of them can be useful. So it starts with the greatness. We know about the rejection that Queen Vashti does, and ultimately because of that she loses her place of prominence, and that opens the door for Esther to, for lack of better words, win the beauty pageant and become the queen. One thing that's significant about the book of Esther, God is never mentioned. And I'm sure we probably mention that every time that we bring it up, but you can see God's hand throughout it. We can see God's faithfulness in preserving his people throughout the book. And same way in our lives today. We may not have any new divine revelation, but let's make sure that we recognize God's hand is involved in our lives. And so this is just a good example of that. So it opens there. It goes on to talk about Haman, who is elevated. One of the things that's interesting with Haman being an Agite, who is one of the versions of Canaanites. So he would have been in opposition to Mordecai and to Esther because they're Jews. So we see a conflict already just by that much. Then Haman's decree to kill the Jews. So the word for the dice that he rolls is for Purim. It's an interesting point we can make during cycle 3, I'm sure. Then we see Esther and Mordecai's plan there in chapter 4 to reverse the decree of what had been done. Now we know, according to the Persians, they had a law that once the decree was sealed with the signet, it could not be undone. So they couldn't just undo it, so they had to come up with some countermeasures. And essentially that's what went on, that they were allowed to defend themselves and fight against those who would overtake them. And we know that was allowed after Esther approached the king bravely because of those situations there. Well, once the thing started going, Esther reveals Haman's plan, his plot, and by appealing to his pride, which we saw there, we see the interesting chapter to me is there in chapter 6. Some people talk about how this is where Ahasuerus has the dream and remembers that Mordecai was the one that told the guards about, or told him about the guards that were going to kill him. And so now we see Haman was plotting to kill the Jews, and now Mordecai is the one being exalted. And so there's a major pivot that goes on there. So reversing the decree, Mordecai and Esther do save the people, and that's really what it comes down to. And Mordecai is elevated there at the end of the book, really to take Haman's place because he died on his own gallows. So I know that's a very quick run through of the book of Esther, but it's a pretty straightforward narrative that hopefully you can listen to that. I think 35 minutes or so, if you want to just sit down and listen to that. That's an easy car ride. So, any thoughts on the book of Esther before we get to the last half of Ezra? So now we get to the last portion of Ezra, and this is the second wave. So we had the first wave with Zerubbabel. We have the insertion of the story of Esther. And then we get to Ezra, who is the priest. So Zerubbabel was commissioned to do what? What was his major job? Rebuild the temple. The temple was not there. Ezra, what was his job? What was he commissioned to do? Reinstitute the law. He was a scribe by trade, And so observing the law and fulfilling the commands of what had been done. The wall itself comes with Nehemiah in the next section. But so we see Ezra going, and then he prepares to depart for Jerusalem there in Ezra chapter 8. Then his journey to Jerusalem, we know that he doesn't have an easy road the whole time. And then there at the end of Ezra the book of Ezra, in chapters 9 and 10, we get to some interesting material about the unfaithfulness of the exiles and the things that he had to do to help restore purity to the people. There's different positions that people hold on this, but this is what Ezra was sent to do, was to restore what the law, restore them as a holy people. And so there were some things that he had the people do and some repentance that had to take place that was not easy.
And this really goes back to the idea of the covenant. We've talked about that on multiple occasions, and the blessings and the cursings and the command of God for the people to keep the covenant. They weren't doing that. And that's a big part of what Ezra went to do, was to bring back, to revitalize the nation spiritually. And he was a teacher of God's law. And so he was going to bring their life back into accordance with the covenant that God made with the people. So
it was I think this would have been harder to deal with than what Zerubbabel had to deal with. Just building something, I mean, you don't have bricks talking back to you and arguing with you as much. But when you look at chapter 9 and verse 3, it said, "When I heard about this matter, I tore my garments and my robe and pulled some of my hair from my head and my beard and sat down in consternation." He realized he had some issues that he had to deal with. So he was pretty tore up about that. And so the last section of the book of Ezra is about the foreign wives and having to separate from them. There's some interesting views on that I'm not going to go into, but some would say that he was speaking outside of God's parameters. I don't see that. I think that this was what God wanted him to do, to teach that they needed to purify themselves from the people around them. And so we see the mixed marriages being addressed, and that's where the book of Ezra closes. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, Ezra and Nehemiah are really just one work, one piece. And so that gets us to Nehemiah.
Yep. And Ezra's going to make a pretty significant debut in the book of Nehemiah as well. Just a little bit about him before we take a look at the book itself. He arrived about 13 years after Ezra. So that's a smaller period of time between Zerubbabel and the group that he brought back, and then Ezra and the group that he brought back. So Ezra's been there about 13 years teaching the law. Still a lot of work to be done in bringing the people of God into the covenant. Nehemiah is actually going to help with some of that. But does anyone remember what Nehemiah's primary task and accomplishment is? Okay, yeah, he's going to rebuild the walls around the city of Jerusalem. Interestingly, we're also going to see him help populate the city as well, but we'll get to that as we progress through his story. So the primary issue he deals with is the rebuilding of the walls. In chapter, not only that, he serves as governor over the people of Judah for about 12 years. And you can go to Nehemiah 5. We can really date his chronology real accurately because he references, in this year of Artaxerxes the king. Okay, and you'll remember that's really where he was whenever he takes on this mission to rebuild the walls. He's cupbearer to the king in Persia. And so it's there that he hears word about what's going on at Jerusalem. The temple's been rebuilt, but the nation still doesn't have any walls. What's the significance of that, by the way? Yeah, no walls. What's the significance of that? Why was it such a burden to Nehemiah to take on this task and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, of the city? Okay, yeah. So there was walls were the protection from the outsiders, and so that was a significant portion of it. And I mean, it's just the restoration of the city. When you think about the foretelling of Jeremiah that Jerusalem's going to be restored and is going to be re-inhabited. Well, it ain't going to be if the walls are rebuilt. And so he sees that as a barrier in between that and the fulfillment of God's promise. And so in order to bring that into being, he's going to go and he's going to focus his time on the rebuilding of the walls. And so he asked God to remember the covenant that he made, to bring the people back and to give him favor in the eyes of the king of Persia, where he is currently serving. And so that's what the first chapter is. Word gets brought to him about the issues in Jerusalem, primarily the walls being destroyed, and he prays and asks God to intervene and work favorably on his behalf. In chapter 2, we see him making the journey. So he's actually there before the king. He was cupbearer to the king, and one day he's down, and the king realizes it and said, hey, what's going on? And so that indicates he's got a pretty strong relationship with the king, that he would be able to observe that this particular servant was having a bad day. Something was bothering him. And so the king inquires and said, hey, what's going on? I can see you're distraught. And Nehemiah tells him, the word's been brought to me that the walls of Jerusalem are torn down. And it's at that point he prays and he asks God to give him favor. And he makes a request of the king to be able to return home and to rebuild the walls to the city in Jerusalem. So God grants him favor. He is released to go back. In Nehemiah 2:10, we read that he's going to encounter some adversaries pretty quickly. They're introduced to us in chapter 2, verse 10. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. Okay, and so they are governors of other Persian regions in that area surrounding Jerusalem, and they were happy to see the downfall and the destruction in Jerusalem. When they hear that someone's seeking the good of that people, that doesn't make them happy. They're going to be the primary adversaries in the rebuilding of the wall. So that's Tobiah and Sanballat. In chapter 3, the rebuilding of the wall begins. You have different leaders that were going and working on different sections of the wall, and so he kind of allocates different people. Priests would work in certain areas, and different families would work in certain areas. And so it's interesting to look at the 12 gates that lead into Jerusalem, and I was able to really deep dive into this. I taught back in Saratoga through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah to see the 12 gates that are there that lead into the city, and to see the process of how the wall is rebuilt and who is involved in the rebuilding of each section. He takes the time to put certain people in certain areas, and the rebuilding begins, but it doesn't take long before opposition to the work begins as well from Sanballat and Tobiah. You want to jump in real quick?
Yeah, one point I want to make. There in chapter 3, everybody was involved with this work. Chapter 3, verse 1, then Eliashib the high priest arose with his brothers and priests and built the sheep gate.
Yep.
Don't you think the high priest, of all the people, the high priest, he's going to be out there toting bricks? Yes, because it's that important.
Yep.
Because it's what God wanted them to do, and nobody was immune from getting out of the work. It was the work that God had set before them. And
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. And what's interesting about the point that Luke just made, the priests themselves working, the sheep gate, that's the gate that leads in most directly to the temple. Obviously, sheep were one of the primary animals that were sacrificed, and so it's interesting that they take ownership of the area where the sacrificial animals are going to be brought in and then brought to the temple. And so that's kind of where the priests were working. That being said, there was one group that did not help in the rebuilding of the wall, and he highlights them, and they aren't praised for that. What we're going to see, and when you really study through this more deeply, there seem to be some political connections between the opposition and the Jews themselves that are rebuilding. In fact, you've got, I think the Samaritans are really among this group. We want to help rebuild the wall. We want to help restore Jerusalem to greatness again. And pretty much what Nehemiah is going to say, hey, you guys aren't a part of this. This is for Jews. This is for the people of God. And so he keeps them from engaging in the work, and consequently that really sets them against him because they want to be involved, but they're not pure-blooded Jews. They were the result of the intermarriage of the Assyrians and the Israelites. And so he says, look, this isn't your job. This is our job. Okay? And so it's at that point that they begin to oppose him in different ways. This is where Luke had mentioned that you had the workers, they had a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other. Okay? And so they were working, and at the same time they were prepared to go to war whenever Tobiah and Sanballat brought in people to really give them trouble. In chapter 5, you kind of got a break from the rebuilding of the wall. This seems to probably happen in the midst of this. There's just so much going on. One of the major problems and sins among the people was injustice. And when you read through the prophets, you find out just how big of a deal injustice is in the eyes of God. And so one of the primary injustices that was occurring was the people had been taken captives by the Babylonians and then by the Persians. And then some of the ones were going back home, remember with that first wave, but the wealthy Jews were essentially buying up all of the land and enslaving their own people. And Nehemiah says, God has released us from our oppressors, from our those holding us captive, and now you're oppressing and holding captive the very people of God, your own brethren. Okay? And so they were loaning them money, but they were doing so at extremely high interest rates. And Nehemiah says that's against the law of God. And so, he helps to clear all of those debts, and the land that was taken by the rich was given back, so each individual has their ancestral inheritance. And so he helps to kind of restore and equalize things while the poor were being oppressed by the rich there. He takes some time to deal with that as this rebuilding the wall takes place. In chapter 6, they've got further opposition, and they begin to threaten Nehemiah's life. And they're just trying to get him to stop building. In fact, one of the priests tries to deceive Nehemiah by saying, hey, they're going to try to assassinate you. Come hide in the temple. Okay, Nehemiah's not a priest. He can't go in the temple. If he goes in the temple, then he can be punished for that, and that's going to put an end to the entire the restoration and rebuilding of the wall. So he's working with the enemies of Nehemiah to get him into the temple to stop the work. And Nehemiah says, I'm not going into the temple. I'm not going to hide there. And so finally, after much opposition, the temple was completed in a short 52 days. And that goes back to the statement that was made where it said that the people had a mind to work, and that's why they were able to accomplish that in such a short period of time. A very significant event happening in chapter 7, that's a record of the returned exiles. I think that's what we see in Ezra chapter 2, pretty much just a restatement of that. In chapter 8, you have the law and the Feast of Booths, the Feast of the Tabernacles that were kept there after the wall has been rebuilt. In chapter 9, you've got national repentance. And so again, Nehemiah looks at the state of the nation and realizes we haven't kept God's covenant. And pretty much what he does is he prays and he asks forgiveness for the sins of the people through the centuries leading up to his own generation. And so they confess their faithlessness of the past, and then because of that, they again make a covenant with God. And that's in Nehemiah 9:38. The covenant's then signed by the leaders of the Jews, and the obligations were of the covenant: they wouldn't intermarry, they wouldn't work on the Sabbath, they would forgo planting in the 7th year so the land could enjoy its rest, they would bring the first fruits and the tithes to God, and they would walk in the laws that were given by Moses. So a very significant event happening where the leaders of Judah signed the covenant that they were going to obey the laws of God. In chapter 11, Jerusalem is populated. So most of the remnant that went back, they scattered in the surrounding area. Jerusalem didn't have its walls. It was a dangerous place. And so they had planted and they'd settled outside of Jerusalem. But he realizes Jerusalem is central because the temple's there, God's name is there. Jerusalem is central to the restoration of God's promise. And so they cast lots, and 1 out of every 10 families came back so that the city of Jerusalem would be populated. Okay? And so if he wouldn't have done this, then it would have remained probably largely uninhabited. So again, a great sacrifice were made by a portion of the nation to repopulate the city of Jerusalem. In chapter 12, the wall is rededicated. The priests and Levites are recorded, and there's a great celebration just dedicating the wall and praising God for the work that he had done in making that opportunity available for them to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Okay, it's at this point that he goes back to Persia for a time, and then he comes back again. We don't know how long he was gone, probably a couple of years at the most. But again, the nation falls into disrepair and spiritual disobedience. Again, he comes back. He finds one of the enemies given a place in the temple, given one of the rooms in the temple. So he takes all his junk, he throws it out, and he purifies the place where he was at. He finds the people working on the Sabbath. He finds the Levites had quit serving in the temple because the people weren't tithing, they weren't being cared for, and so they returned to work. And he finds the people again intermarrying, and just kind of concluding, thinking about Ezra and Nehemiah, what's the biggest difference between those two? The difference between Ezra and Nehemiah, there was some overlap in that, is that Ezra pulled his own hair out when he got aggravated with the people, and Nehemiah pulled other people's hair out when he got aggravated with the people. So Luke can reference the passage where Ezra's distressed and he sits down and pulls out his hair and beard. Nehemiah 13:25, I confronted them and I cursed them and I beat some of them and pulled out their hair. So that's the difference between Ezra and Nehemiah.
Literally did that.
Ezra pulls his own hair out, Nehemiah pulls other people's hair out. That's how you tell the difference between those two guys. And near the end of the book, repeatedly he prays, "Remember me for good, oh my God." And certainly a man who sought the welfare of God and the welfare of God's people, and he prays rightfully that God would remember him for good.
And that brings us to the years of silence, because the last book was Malachi, which ends 430, 440 in that time range. And so this was getting very close to